Today's topic is handling difficult conversations. I'll be your instructor today. My name is Maggie Fountain. I was born in Tempe, Arizona, and I went off to NAU and got a degree in Spanish and history. And I was a Spanish teacher for 18 years in a high school district. And then I transitioned into a position working as a content specialist in social studies and world languages. And then I've been working as a professional development coordinator for the last few years in my district. So I look forward to our time together. Before we even get started, can you visualize or jot down on a piece of paper a difficult conversation you've experienced? I want you to think about something that didn't go well that you had hoped would go better. So pause the video right now and take a moment to jot that down on a piece of paper near you. Thanks for writing that down. As we go through today's presentation, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we think through some of the strategies that we're going to explore. How could we have maybe handled this differently? Our objectives today are to improve your communication strategies when engaging in difficult conversations with parents and colleagues. And we'll break this down into 4 key learning today. You can describe why conversations can be hard. You can evaluate why you yourself might not engage in those conversations. We'll look through some strategies that you can employ when you're having those difficult conversations and think about how we can apply this to your work. So let's go to our first learning target today. What makes a conversation difficult? We might call it a courageous conversation or a hard conversation, but what are we exactly talking about? We have conversations every day, and not all of them are what we would define as difficult. So let's make sure that we're all on the same page. When we define a difficult conversation, it's really any conversation where there is a strong differences of opinion between two people. Often it has the potential to become emotional. So, as always, when we come into conversations, we have usually expectations of what we think will happen as we come into that conversation. And sometimes these are based on our relationship with the person, a similar scenario, what we think we're talking about. And oftentimes, what makes the conversation difficult is when our expectations are not met. So, what I am expecting isn't what happens. And oftentimes, that brings about it a bunch of emotions. So look back at that conversation that you jotted down. Did you have one expectation about how that was going to happen? Do you think the other person had a different expectation? Did things get emotional during that conversation? Let's explore why a little bit more. Oftentimes, difficult conversations are characterized by emotions such as fear, anger, frustration, conflict, and other strong, dividing, not unifying emotions. And those emotions can be strong. And when they become strong enough to overcome a person's natural inhibitions against acting on his or her emotions, the behaviors driven by the strong emotion may not be appropriate. Our anxiety level starts to build. You might notice that your breathing and heart rate increases. Your muscles might start to tense up. Your voice and facial expressions are going to become much harder to control. And so you may not be communicating exactly what you want through your body language. And so in all of this, it becomes much harder to structure our thoughts and to stay rational during this. For example, if I'm coming into a situation and I expect one thing, and as I'm going through it, that teacher that I might be working with is getting more and more irritated or annoyed by me. And so my anxiety starts to build up. And that's what really then becomes that difficult conversation. Oftentimes, the root of the conversation, the topic itself, is not what makes it difficult. It's how we feel about it. We can be having the same conversation in different places, but it's our own emotions and expectations that really trigger whether it's going to be difficult or not. And that's because our body is being controlled by our brain. Our amygdala in our brain, which is really like part of our root brain, if you look at the picture here on the bottom right, you'll see it right there in that center. It defines and regulates our emotions. Early humans developed a fight or flight response to deal with threats and dangers. And this was an automatic response to danger, allowing you to react quickly without the need to think. And the amygdala is the part of our brain that controls this. So when a person feels stressed or afraid, the amygdala is going to release stress hormones that prepare the body to fight, flight, or freeze based on what our natural inclination is when we're dealt with stress. So common emotions that trigger our stress include fear, anger, anxiety, and aggression. And sometimes it may not even be within our control that these triggers happen and our brain is releasing these hormones into our body. And that's known as an amygdala hijack. Because our amygdala, like we talked about before, it's like our guard dog. It's always looking out and making sure that we are ready for any kind of threat that comes our way. And so when it gets activated, it activates that fight or flight response, and our rational brain shuts down, and our thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, then becomes bypassed, and we're sending stuff straight to the emotional brain. So if you think about it as it's a speed highway and we are no longer stopping at any of the places along the way that's our rational thought, we're just streaming down that stress thought. And we can look at that amygdala hijack through a hand motion called flipping your lid. So I'd like you to take a moment and go ahead and watch this video. It's both linked in your handout, or you can take a moment and scan the QR code. Come back when you finish this video. As you watch that video and they talked about flipping your lid, look at that situation that you put on your sticky note, the one you visualized at the beginning. Did you or the someone you were having the conversation with flip their lid? What happened? How did you feel? Were you able to think critically and thoughtfully, or did your emotions take control? What might you have done to unflip your lid? Take a moment and think about that. Another way sometimes that we can think about our stress is through an analogy about a stress animal. Just kind of a fun way that when we can identify how we react in stress, because everybody reacts differently, that amygdala triggers either again, fight, flight, or freeze, we're going to act differently. So in your handout, or you can use the Scan Me code up there at the top of the slide, I want you to read through the handout. Look at the way that these 8 animals are described. Which one do you most identify with? And some people might say, well, I'm a little bit of a couple of them, and that's okay. But think about what is your general primary reaction when you're in great stress? Take a moment, pause the video, and go read your handout. Thanks for coming back. So, as you look through that crab, the lion, the pufferfish, the duck, the ostrich, the panda, the turtle, or the cow, which kind of animal are you? And take a moment to reflect. What type of animal are you when you flip your lid? How do you handle stressful situations? What's positive about that reaction? And what can be negative about your style? Do you find you're more of an aggressor or an avoider? If I'm honest, I'm a turtle. And so when I'm faced with really stressful, difficult conversations, I tend to withdraw into myself. I'm quiet. I want to avoid the situation. The positives are that I don't tend to lash out. I don't tend to escalate a situation because I withdraw. But the negatives then are sometimes my feelings aren't getting heard and I'm not handling the situation. So I'm much more of an avoider than an aggressor. What about you? It's really important for us to know how we react because we come into contact with different kinds of reactions all the time. What happens when a lion meets a turtle? So, my little turtle behavior comes in contact with a lion. We have to know how we ourselves react so that sometimes we can counteract our own natural inclinations, but also so that we know how we're interacting with others. It's important to know your own stress animal, but also who you might be dealing with. Because these, again, these discrepancies and expectations are often what makes a conversation difficult. So when I expect someone else to be low key and calm and maybe avoid a hard conversation like a little turtle, and I come into contact with a very aggressive lion, it can cause more tension. We talked about what might cause stress. And now let's explore more why we're often reluctant to have those difficult conversations. It's often our own perception or expectations that cause us to see something as difficult. So when we explore why we're reluctant, we might be able to avoid those difficult conversations because they won't actually be difficult conversations. So when we looked at those animals from before, some of them are aggressors and some of them are avoiders. As you look through the 8, what do you think? Generally, we would say the crab, the lion, and the puffer are aggressors. They tend to escalate when under stress, whereas a ostrich, panda, or turtle will not. And then our duck and our cow are those that are often a little bit better at handling the situation. The duck might be smooth on top but stressed underneath, and you don't necessarily know. And a cow is just someone who's really good at being able to control their emotions. But when we look at those two different categories, aggressors and avoiders, avoiders tend to have a natural aversion to confrontation. They're much more worried about hurting people's feelings. They don't want to risk the relationship, so they tend to avoid. They are worried about how others might be reacting, and so they want to avoid the difficult conversation. They're worried about how they themselves might react, and they're often catastrophizing or thinking about the worst case scenario. But unfortunately, by avoiding, oftentimes these difficult situations become more escalated, become bigger. And so it's really not a great strategy to just avoid. And then when we take an opposite end and look at those aggressors, they can take pride into taking matters in their own hands and resolving the conflict, but they might be more abrupt or perceived as bullying. And they might try and rush in and antagonize the person they're working with, which doesn't help the situation either. And in fact, could make it worse. So read through this list of 18 different reasons why we hesitate. Which one resonates with you? Take a moment, pause the video, and look through the list. Thanks for looking through. Did you identify 1 to 2 reasons? For me, when I was confronting another teacher about something they were doing that I didn't think was good for kids, I often didn't think it was my job as a teacher to do that. So I would tend to hesitate, feeling that it wasn't my responsibility and it wasn't really my role. But then when I became a department chair, it was my job to do those things. And so I had to have the conversation. And so actually, I appreciated when a colleague might have had the conversation for me and avoided the conversation for me. But generally, we have to think about why we hesitate and what causes that so that we can adjust it so that we can get better at it. Many times, the reasons why we hesitate is our own sense of stress and anxiety. We're worried about confrontations that might leave us vulnerable and we feel uncomfortable and we want to avoid the conflict. Thinking about those animals. What happens if the pufferfish is talking to an ostrich? We worry about how those things are going to happen, and so we don't engage in the conversation. So let's explore some ways that we can get better at having these conversations and not avoiding them. Going back to your event, what was the issue that caused the conversation? How much time did you spend preparing for the conversation before having it? What were your emotions you were feeling? How clearly were you or the other person thinking during the heated portions? Was there any relational damage control that had to be done afterwards? Pause the video and take a moment to think through these topics. We're going to explore 5 tips that might help us to handle a difficult conversation better. Those are preparing for the conversation, preparing yourself for the conversation, how you begin the conversation, during the conversation, and ending the conversation. We're going to explore these 5 more in more depth in just a minute. Go into your handout and read through the 5 different steps. What connects to what you already know or think? How can you extend your knowledge into something new? And what challenges you or makes you question what's going on? So read through the 5 different tips, pausing the video, making notes in your handout, and come back when you're done. Thanks for coming back. As you look through those key ideas, what were some key takeaways for preparing for the conversation? Thinking about how you yourself need to be prepared, how you might begin the conversation, what you're doing during the conversation, and how you end the conversation. Oftentimes, like a classroom lesson, we want to think about the beginning, the middle, and the end. So let's explore these some more. How can you get better at having these conversations? We'll practice and get better since practice makes perfect. When we looked at how to start the conversation, sometimes getting it started is the hardest part. Pause the video and look through these question stems about how you can begin. Are there some you like better than others? Circle or mark the ones that you think you could use. Read them out loud to practice saying them. Because sometimes they can feel awkward at first, but the more we get used to saying them, the more natural they'll feel in the conversation. Getting started often means planning out our conversation. So, this conversation planner that's in your note guide can be a great starting place for you to practice. You're going to think about what you want, what you think they might be expecting, so we can deal with those different expectations that we have. We're going to think about how we'll open that conversation, possibly using some of the stems you just had. Think about how you can communicate effectively. What message do you need to get across? What evidence or examples do you have that will help you to get that message? Think about anticipating their reactions and responses. How what might their reaction be? How will you respond to that? Because staying in our thinking brain and staying out of our amygdala brain is helping us keep connected in that critical thinking instead of using our emotional brain. But then when we're in those emotions, how can we plan for what they might be feeling and what we might be feeling? And then think about how could you close the conversations and what would you do on the next step? Using the conversation you jotted down at the beginning, pause this video and work through this planner with the difficult conversation you had in mind. How can this help you to be better prepared for the future? Now practice using some of these. How did that go for you? Did you utilize any of the strategies presented? How did they help you? If not, what do you still need to work on? And as Janine Phillips says, sometimes the most important conversations are the most difficult to engage in. And that's why it's so important for us to take time and to think about the skills we need as we come into these conversations. So, for our last learning target today, what have you learned today that you can apply the next time you have to have a difficult conversation? Self reflect on why you might hesitate. Analyze how you react in a stressful situation and what you can do to improve that. Evaluate the tips that have been presented today about having a difficult conversation and think about which ones you want to implement next time. What other ideas have you learned today that you can take forward in your work? Our why here at Grand Canyon University is to empower, educate, and inspire our community so that they take action to fulfill their purpose and serve others. I hope you've learned something today that can help you moving forward. The evaluation can be found here using this QR code or the short link. This was Difficult Conversations, and my name was Maggie Fountain. As always, you can find On Demand PD through canyonpd.com through our Solutions to Go, where you found this course. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Take a moment to scan that QR code or type in that bit.ly. And here are some of the references for you today. I hope you found something today that will be helpful for you in the future. Have a great day.